All right. How's everybody doing? My name is Jesse Bennett, and I'm the Executive Director for North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition. I'm also a former IV drug user, formerly incarcerated person as well. And let's see if I can get it to work. And today we're going to talk about the intersection of race and class in the war on drugs. And so, real quick, North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition is one of the state's comprehensive harm reduction agencies. We work directly with people who use drugs, engage in sex work, and try to reduce the harms associated with those practices. So, and we'll jump right into it. I don't know. I'm gonna try my best to get through it all in 1 hour. It's a big feat here, so we'll try. And so I really like to start out with these quotes. And those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. And so, I don't like to say no to drugs or yes to drugs, but I like to say why. And so what started me on this path is understanding why are drugs illegal. And I think a lot of us don't really comprehend or understand that why drugs are illegal. I think for the most part, we think because they're bad or they're not healthy. And so we're going to learn through this process that that is not the case. And so thinking about this, right? In Baltimore, a young Black man is sent to prison for felony cannabis possession. In Scotland, somebody's apartment door is kicked in by a drug squad. In Afghanistan, a field of poppies is incinerated from the air. In Mexico, police corrupted by drug cartels are implicated in disappearance and massacres. So understanding that this isn't just a problem here, but that the war on drugs, being as entrenched as it is as an American problem, affects the rest of the world. And so a lot of people think, that the war on drugs started with Nixon. I think it's really the only president that declared it. The war on drugs has been happening for quite some time, back in the 1800s. And when we think about, what was going on then, we were building railroads, individuals were immigrated from China, come over to help build the railroad. And so part of the problem in the eyes of Americans, individuals, they were illegal, they were taking jobs, and they were able to live in a way that normal people didn't live in America, and save money. And so one of the customs and cultures of the time of Chinese immigrants was opium dens, specifically in San Francisco. And they were popular, right? They were considered chic. Opium was, there's a lot of things going on, bad sanitation, menstrual issues, and nothing stops you up like opium, right? And so, they didn't make it illegal because different people were using it. And then here we have individuals who were, had these opium dens going. And so kind of this idea or the media representation of, this white women were being enslaved and becoming addicted. And this is kind of where the quote unquote first drug war started. And San Francisco started this, they had an ordinance. So it wasn't a federal law or a state law. It was just an ordinance where these couldn't exist. And so media depiction, right? Down there it says, why can they live on 40 cents a day and they can't, right? And so not only is it, this is kind of what we hear today, even the representation of what's happening looks strikingly different. And then, we have pictures of white women in these opium dens, and just, this is the stuff that the media really portrayed. And as you'll see, as we go through this process, this is a tactic of controlling cultures and customs. And this was all centered around Chinese immigration. They wanted, to get individuals out of America that were not Americans, well, specifically white Americans. And it's insane. They called it yellow peril, and we had to get get these Chinese people out of our country because they were taking our jobs. And so kind of the timeline of this is 1860s, you had mass casualties, Civil War was going on, and morphine use was pretty well in effect. And you have 400,000 soldiers who are addicted, and Chinese exclusion comes through, and then you have opium that's prescribed for female problems, and then Bayer, they actually were the first ones to formulate heroin. And it was designed to be a remedy for coughs and colds, and specifically to children. And so it was marketed towards children as a children cough suppressant. The word heroin comes from, so Bayer employees are the ones that tested their products, not any science or anything like that. And Bayer employee took heroin and ingested it and said they felt heroic. And so the name of heroin was born through this process. And yes, it is the same Bayer that makes Bayer aspirin today. The first syringe was invented in 1843. Ironically, Alexander Wood's wife dies of an injection morphine overdose. And so, looking at that syringe right there is, I just can't even imagine trying to mess with that at this time of day. And so here's over-the-counter, heroin hydrochloride for injection. And more it was completely legal. And you had all these pharmacists who were compounding products. They had cocaine toothache drops, again, targeted towards children, cubed morphine. And then, getting into drinks, you got cocaine candy and coca wine. And, it was everywhere. Cocaine was in everything, and opium was in everything. But then the demonization starts coming, right? And, it's 1914, and, they have the temperance movement is striking up, and the issues around alcohol are really coming to fruition. And, here comes the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914. And what it states is that, narcotics are illegal, but a doctor can prescribe these, but they had to they had to have a tax stamp. So they had to pay, a modest $1 tax stamp, and they could dispense opium and coca. And so, but they could only prescribe narcotics for the treatment of a disease, and narcotic addiction was not considered a disease at this time. It was considered a moral failing. And, there was a lot of challenges around Harrison Narcotics Act. And, these treatment clinics, so doctors would, there was a lot of people addicted to opiates, and they were giving them daily medications to, so they could actively function in life. And that's what we see today with, opioid-based treatment programs and MAT clinics, methadone clinics, things like that. And this idea of the moral issue was rampant, and this is on the heels of prohibition as well, alcohol prohibition. And so cocaine also becomes illegal. And this is, the paper of the day, the New York Times, this is where you hear about, it takes, crazed Negroes running the streets, run rampant on cocaine, attacking people, and it takes a 45 to take them down, and that's when the service revolver was replaced with a 45 versus a 38, and, running around attacking white women, right? And all through time, women, and specifically white women and their children, are used in this kind of negative connotation of attacking people of color. And here it is. I mean, this is the New York Times, right? And they're printing this stuff as actual news. And it's just amazing to think back. If we saw something like this in the newspaper today, it would be crazy, right? And this whole idea that since prohibition was happening and people couldn't have their liquor anymore, they were taking the sniffing white powder. And so kind of how Harrison works, again, you are taxed by each gram. And so you can sell opiates if you have this tax stamp. But if you got caught with opiates without paying the tax, you went to jail for tax evasion. And so this still exists today. Harrison Act is still exists. You know, right now, if I got locked up for trafficking or selling drugs, I would get charged by each gram. I would get taxed for it. And then that would be my fine. I would have to pay these taxes back to the IRS for these drugs. But yet I can't go pay taxes on the drugs that I'm selling, but I can be taxed for it. So yeah, so all clinics, these clinics or care clinics were closed. All these physicians were indicted, and you know the drug war is in full swing. Absolutely. By 1923, all of these clinics were closed, and you know the idea of addiction medicine and research around it was done. And so we didn't even talk about addiction research or research around drug use until Nixon declared a war on drugs. So over 50 years of research is missing. So again, so coming through, you know, opium dens, Chinese exclusion, we have the Harrison Act, you know, the idea of this moral failing, and then, you know, blacks accused of stealing white women, prohibition. And then we have the Bureau of Narcotics is formed in 1930 under Harry Anslinger. And Anslinger was a nasty, nasty fella. He invented the shock and awe tactics that we see today. When you see in the newspaper or the media with you know, cops standing around a table with drugs piled up and weapons, that's a Harry Anslinger thing. It makes it seem like that they're doing their job, right? They're ridding the world of drugs. 1937, the tax stamp started coming, the Marijuana Tax Act, and this idea of making marijuana illegal. But why? And so the Mexican Revolution ended in 1920. Yeah, prohibition is in full swing. And so individuals were coming from Mexico into states like Texas and Louisiana searching for work. And they were working in the fields, and they brought with them their native customs and cultures. And one of these was the use of cannabis as a relaxant and a medicine. And so the crazy thing about this is that the reason why it became illegal is because Mexican immigrants were, you know, they were using the word marijuana. And so, you know, what is this marijuana? They're smoking it and, you know, let's make it illegal. But little did they realize that they already had cannabis in basically everything in their medicine cabinets, paper, rope, everything was made with cannabis until the Marijuana Tax Act. So this method of controlling people by controlling their customs was successful, right? They've done it through the years, and it continued to control and to keep tabs on individuals. And so that was what they wanted. They wanted to be able to watch them. They wanted to be able to stop and search people whenever they wanted. And you know, this whole idea of controlling customs and ethnocentrism is really what it is. You know, white people, and specifically white Americans, really struggle with the idea of different cultures from them, and things are scary, right? And this seemed like out of their control. And by controlling their customs, they can keep individuals in control. So they think. Again, newspaper, right? This is what people are reading in the newspaper that have no idea what's going on, and they're reading about, is the Mexican nation locoed by a peculiar weed? I mean, I just can't even imagine thinking about reading this in the paper. And so Harry Anslinger also understood that with using the media to get out, you know, stigma and like how we view people who use drugs is a tactic that is still continued and used today. And so you have these, you know, these magazines that kids have access to, and it's like Reefer Madness or The Weed from the Devil's Garden, and this idea that, you know, marijuana would just make you go crazy and out of control, and you know, you want to feed your family to this thing. It's just crazy. And so Reefer Madness is actually became a cult classic. And now people smoke lots of marijuana and watch this crazy movie that was created. And so this is Harry Anslinger, nasty fella. And he states that most marijuana smokers are Negroes, Hispanics, jazz musicians, and entertainers. Doesn't sound too bad to me. Their satanic music is driven by marijuana, and marijuana smoking by white women makes them want to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and others. It is a drug that causes insanity, criminality, and death, and it is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. Those are pretty powerful words. The most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. And he, you know, he was a pretty racist fella. Sure, a lot of folks were back then. And so, you know, moving forward, you know, we have most things are illegal, but, you know, amphetamines and methamphetamines weren't. They were still in full swing. And, you know, these were invented in Hitler's Germany, methamphetamine was. And later, Japanese soldiers used them, and as well as World War II troops to keep troops awake. And then in 1950s, guess who was using amphetamines? White women, right? And so they were using it as a diet aid, and, you know, to fight depression. The whole nuclear family was in effect, and, you know, these women had to get up, get their families ready, you know, make breakfast and dinners and lunch, and, you know, be the housewife and have everything, like, leave it to Beaver perfect, and everybody came home, right? And so it's, of course, you know, injectable methamphetamine comes along and the abuse factor starts kicking in. And, you know, 1970s, Nixon made everything pretty much illegal. And so Nixon comes along. I thought I had the diet aid. You should have seen these, the kind of the newspaper or the magazine depictions of with methamphetamine. It's like, you know, to control menstrual flow, and, you know, for this diet aid, if you want to keep it slim, they're just wild. They're kind of the media depiction. And so Nixon comes through, you know, declares a war on drugs, and so to be devil's advocate here a little bit, yes, Nixon declared a war on drugs because he was freaking out, right? Soldiers were coming home addicted to opiates. They were using heroin and other morphine over in Vietnam. And this idea of treatment comes into play, right? And again, the soft approach with soldiers and, you know, who are typically white was a different view. And his war on drugs declaration, most of the money was supposed to be going to treatment. And so they created the scheduling system, 1 through, it was 5, and now I think there's 6 schedules, 6 or 7. And so in Schedule 1 is considered there's no medical purpose, so you can't have, there's no money going for research, none of that. And so marijuana is still in the Schedule 1. It was classified back in the 70s, and it remains to this day at the federal level. And so what else was going on was, you know, the civil rights movement was in full swing, and Black Panthers Party was, you know, they were getting strong, and, you know, hippies were against the government because of the Vietnam War. And there was, you know, there was all out war in the streets too. And so this is John Erkelman, and he was the counsel and assistant to the US president. And in 2012, many years later, I'm sorry, in 1992, he comes in and says that, you know, this is what the war was actually about. You know, Nixon had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. And we knew we couldn't make it to be illegal or either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana, Blacks with heroin, then we can, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And so here this man came out in 1992 with this, and nothing changed, nothing. DEA was formed in 1973. And so Treasury, or the Bureau of Narcotics, turns into the DEA. Under the, you know, the DEA is classified under the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is housed in the White House, and only answers to the president. And you see kind of, you know, on the onset, they had a few agents, like 1,000, and then 75 million. And today they're a $1 billion agency with thousands of special agents all over the world. And this National Security Decision Directive 221 authorizes military involvement in coca-source countries, which means that, you know, now they can purchase military grade weapons, specifically like Black Hawk helicopters. And so Black Hawk helicopters are used in Colombia for coca leaf eradication, and there's DEA agents all over Colombia trying to get rid of coca leaves. And so while Nixon was saying, yes, we need to fight this drug war with treatment and, you know, research, Reagan comes in and he throws shade, and you know, Reaganomics, you know, was supposed to be trickle down, right? All the rich people would make money, which would benefit the poor people. And what we actually saw was the defunding of schools, the defunding of social safety nets, and, you know, the decimation of inner city neighborhoods. And, you know, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and kind of the middle class disappeared. And so Reagan says, we're taking down the surrender flag and we're running up the battle flag, right? That's a pretty clear-cut signal of what's going to happen. And so boom. And Reagan was really good about understanding Harry Anslinger's process and how to use the media to get everybody in the public whipped up about, you know, drugs, and specifically what was happening then in the 80s was crack. And, you know, he was able to pass the Anti-Drug Abuse Act through Congress with bipartisan support. And then, you know, more money to fund the war on drugs. Sentencing Reform Act also came in this, you know, 29 new mandatory minimum for drug sentences. And, you know, the 100-to-1 comes into play too. So mandatory minimums and understanding that crack and powder cocaine are a 100-to-1 difference. So crack is 100 times more powerful than powder cocaine, even though they're the same drug. But, you know, generally whites use powder and blacks use crack cocaine. And so here we go again with the demonization of a substance. And so crack hysteria is in full swing. Boy, I came up through the 80s, and it was interesting times, to say the least. Just Say No, and, you know, This Is Your Brain on Drugs, which I was a kid then, and I had no idea why my brain had a representation of eggs. It just really made me hungry. So it didn't work for the youth, right? And so DARE was in full swing, and, you know, Just Say No. And so crack babies and crack whores, and, you know, here's Tom Brokaw in the background on NBC News and just reporting about, you know, crack babies and this whole thing. Time declares in 1986 crack as the issue of the year, right? And this whole thing is just being whipped up, and everybody's talking about crack. And, you know, no, of course, white people don't smoke crack, right? It's just in the inner city. And so it does, you know, everybody's smoking crack in the 80s, and the 100-to-1 comes into play, and this is what it looks like, right? When we see it visualized as this separate but equal. And so this person over here, I'm in for 500 grams of powder cocaine, and it's 5 grams, and it says down in the corner, it's just that some people are more equal than others. 100 times more. And so Clinton comes along, and, you know, I like to say that Clinton is the proverbial nail in the coffin to the war on drugs. You know, if there was any moment in time to kind of turn the corner or ebb the flow of the kind of tsunami coming in, Clinton had the opportunity. Of course, he did not. He doubled down, you know, and this was the popular opinion of the day. And so, you know, gangs and drugs has taken over our streets in 1994. And this anti-crime bill, or this omnibus crime bill, had bipartisan support. You know, that's one that Joe Biden gets a lot of flack for, because he was a sponsor of this omnibus bill. And, you know, here's Hillary Clinton, who says that warned about an emerging generation of super predators. And so, which she later recanted when she was running for president. And they, you know, the Clintons offered incentives to states, a lot of Southern states at that, to build more prisons if they had tougher sentences. And then this 3-strike law comes into play. On top of that, you know, he rejects a U.S. sentencing. So a U.S. sentencing commission says, you know what, this disparity is wrong. Crack and powder cocaine are the same. Nope. And then, you know, they could have, what else was going on then in the 80s and 90s was HIV and AIDS was in full swing. And, you know, that's when harm reduction efforts come in America into full swing, and peers, taking care of peers and teaching them how to clean syringes and, you know, safe for smoking, safe for sex, all that stuff. And, you know, the health secretary and the drug czar is over ONDCP, who's over the DEA, comes in and says, you know what, we need to end the federal ban for funding for syringe access programs. Clinton says no, that federal funding ban is still in effect today. So you can't use federal dollars to purchase syringes that are going to needle exchange. 2 weeks after he signs this bill, he enacted the Regal-Neal Interstate Banking Bill, right? So he starts deregulating the financial industry while making the war on drugs even tougher and sentencing tougher. And we all know what happened then, right? The housing collapse comes later because of these deregulating the financial industry. Did any people go to jail for that? Hell no. And so, you know, bankers don't go to jail after losing billions of dollars of Americans' money, but dealers and users do. And so, again, low-level dealers feel the full weight of state and federal power. And then you have bankers who have shackles removed, and we can do whatever we want with money. So this is, you know, there's a lot of different perspectives of the war on drugs, and this is, you know, narrated by Jay-Z, and Jay tells it from his perspective and how he grew up in it.
In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the US blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the US prison population disproportionately, locking away Black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated 50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to Black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, Police issue possession citations in Black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared this so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
So what does everybody think about that? I mean, you know, when you really think about how someone can, let's say I was charged with marijuana, you know, for selling weed, and that's it. That's all I've ever been charged with my entire life. And then it becomes legal in my state to sell weed, but I can't go sell weed, right? And in fact, if I get caught with weed again, I'm gonna have to pay taxes on the weed, but I can't pay on it. So it's a completely messed up system, and you know, it continues to move forward. And you can kind of see in incarceration rates every time drug policy is enacted. I mean, you see 1940 there's a spike, and you know, or from 1920 to 1940 when Harrison is in full swing, and you know, Marijuana Tax Act comes, and then it kind of levels out until the kind of declaration, and then the Sentencing Reform Act is really what just drives home this mass incarceration spike. And you know, this idea that society is benefiting, right? And so it's not though, right? But why does the war on drugs still have so much momentum? And really, who does benefit from it if there's no kind of success in it? So one way is through asset forfeiture laws. Or policing for profit, as I like to call it. And you know, it's these police agencies. You know, they can go in to these drug houses, and all that cash that's stacked up belongs to them. You know, and back, you know, in the 90s, cops would want to come into a drug house. They want the cash because, you know, they would have to destroy the drugs, or with property, they have to auction it off. And, you know, there's more work involved. And what would happen is these kind of vice narcotics within these police departments would become self-sustaining. They wouldn't even need police budget money because they had their own. And then, you know, they started buying military grade weapons, you know, battering ram tanks and these big assault rifles, all these, you know, military grade weapons to fight drug dealers on the street. Inmates. Inmates equal cheap labor, or sometimes free labor. And, you know, this idea that this is modern day slavery. And, you know, it's crazy to think that we can incarcerate humans and make them work, even in 2021, make them work for free. And so the way this happens is when we abolished slavery, and through the 13th Amendment. And so here it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for punishment as a crime, you know, shall exist within the United States, and only Congress can change this. And so with one amendment, we went from slave to convict. And, you know, this is what it looks like, you know, 18th century slavery versus 21st century war on drugs. It doesn't look much different, right? And here you have in the middle, you know, the plantation owners become the prison owners in this prison industrial complex. And, you know, this is, the problem here is when you think about decades and decades of mass incarceration, and you have generations and generations of Black men who are incarcerated and, you know, on probation or parole or in some kind of a watch by either the government or the state. You know, thinking about how, you know, inner cities are just been decimated, and all the effects and trauma that associates with that. And so how many people are locked up in the United States? Quite a few. You know, when we think about a lot of the numbers we hear are federal inmates, you know, 49% are locked up for nonviolent drug offenses. Those are federal inmates. And so when we dig down and think about on the state level, it just gets vast. And then on top of that, you have not only you have the prison system, you have bail system, you have probation and parole, all of these systems within systems that are just, designed to keep people in control or locked in. And we see the various, drug charges. A lot of the property crimes and public order are drug related, burglary, theft, car theft. All these property crimes are essentially, for all intents and purposes, are related to drug use. So again, here's our timeline. Nixon declares, the DEA comes in, 100-1 comes in, and then Reagan, and then Clinton, and then the three strikes. Mass incarceration is in full swing. And so when we look at actual data and federal drug seizures, this is what we see, that the amount, that of drugs that they're actually getting is very high, and it's basically just marijuana. And so, thinking about cocaine, other drugs, methamphetamine, all that, and really the drugs that they want to control or get off the streets aren't. And so it really, when you think about the DEA and all of the different systems involved, corrections, this is big business. The war on drugs is big business. Again, so U.S. attorneys, so federal prosecutors, the cases filed by program category. Pretty interesting, huh? So you have immigration and all drugs. And those, as we've just learned, are tied together, right? And then violent crime only makes up about 20%. And then, of course, all the bankers and lawyers over there in white collar crime. So we've spent over $1 trillion on the war on drugs, $793 a second, right? Or 25 billion per year. And you would think, we get rid of addiction, right? We're controlling drugs. No one's addicted. Oh, wait. Yeah. So this is the problem, right? Is that there's no amount of money or prohibition that can control drugs or drug use, right? And so until we're addressing, the socioeconomic, the social determinants of health, and wellness, until we are addressing the actual problems of drugs and drug use, then addiction rate will remain constant. And that's about 10% of the population will suffer from what we call severely and persistently chemically dependent or chaotic drug use. But the rest of the, there's 90% of the population that either does drugs in a way that isn't chaotic or doesn't do them at all, right? And just like there's people that drink, and then there's people that drink uncontrollably or alcoholically, right? And so not all drug use is problematic. Just because someone uses drugs doesn't mean it's in a chaotic way. And drug use happens along a continuum like most things. So understanding these numbers, that we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. Fun fact, we also have 5% of the world's population and had 25% of the world's COVID infections as well. And so, 1973, there was only 300,000 prisoners, and by 2012, over 2 million. More prisoners than anywhere in the history of time, more prisoners in China, and they have 1 billion more people than us. More prisoners than soldiers, and more prison guards than US Marines. So what I see is that we're not addicted to drugs here, we're addicted to incarceration. So the opioid crisis. So, a lot of people claim opioid is changing the response of how we treat substance users. Is this true, right? That's really something to think about. Are we really treating it, or is it window dressing? Or is this more drug policy dressed up, oh, hey, everything's working out fine. But in the background, people haven't stopped going to prison and jail for drug charges today. Not everybody's getting treatment. And, on top of that, drug dealers or, friends who are giving their friends drugs that die from an overdose are getting indicted with drug-induced homicide. So again, no compassionate talk about drug dealers, yet, Jay really paints the picture of, the whole Colorado legalization and venture capitalists. So even if I didn't have a felony in Colorado and I wanted to open a dispensary, you have to have $10,000 or $100,000 cash up front to get in with these venture capitalists who basically control the marijuana market in these places. And so drug-induced homicide is a law that states that, if I give or sell you a substance, that I can be indicted or charged with second-degree murder. In most drug-induced homicide cases, they have dropped the malice or intent part, so there doesn't have to be intent. And so, of course, in all of this mix, white folks are getting locked up with the same charges. But when we look at the sentencing around drug-induced homicide, we can see striking differences between people of color versus white defendants. And, the idea of drug-induced homicide is to send a message, right? We're going to send a message to drug dealers that, we're not playing, that we're going to lock you up, and that, you can't sell drugs. And this is all about shock and awe, right? More Harry Anslinger. So nothing has really changed in terms of how we enforce or how we scare people away. And so, when we really look at the kind of the breakdown of who is actually giving somebody drugs, it's a 50-50 split from traditional dealer buyer to, caretaker, friend, whatever. And so these laws came about back in the 70s. And so limb bias laws is what it's also called. So limb bias was supposed to be one of the best college basketball players coming out of college. He was drafted by the Boston Celtics. And, he died from a cocaine overdose, celebrating, the draft pick. And, he was supposed to compliment Larry Bird. And it was pretty devastating on the Celtics and, Boston. And it was crazy, the kind of the media attention around it. And of course it was cocaine. And so there more media around that. And these drug-induced or limb bias laws came into effect. And we see down here, 1975, years and years, these laws have been on record, using them sporadically. Boom. In about 2009 or so, when the opioid epidemic starts coming into full swing, we see states really starting to take advantage of it. And then, even enacting laws. North Carolina passed theirs last year. And so the states that are using it the most, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, West Virginia, these are the states that have the highest overdose rates, and they're kind of painting the picture of this is going to reduce overdoses by locking away dealers, low-level dealers. North Carolina said this law is just for kingpins, and I have not yet to see them get a kingpin, and so understanding that nice people use drugs, and people who use drugs are people first, right? All of us are people first, and we have all our other things with us. And it's just we're not victims or clients or patients. It's it could be anybody. It could be daughter, sister, brother, nephew, niece. And so just like anybody else, people who use drugs have feelings too. And so understanding people who use, people who sell, this whole process of drugs and drug use, and how the way we focused it comes from a value-based system. And so how do we end the war on drugs, right? And really getting away from this value-based, right? And coming to a needs-based. And what that means is value-based system looks at the drug and the use as everything. All you got to do is just stop using drugs and everything will be great, right? And so when we do that, we devalidate somebody's experience and history, and fail to recognize, what they're going through in the process or why they're using substances. And a lot of times individuals, why do people use drugs? Trauma, adverse childhood experiences, homelessness, mental illness, homophobia, transphobia, you name it. People use drugs for all types of reasons. Sometimes people could be facing all those things at the same time, right? And so when we think about decriminalizing or legalizing, what does that really look like in this country? And do we decriminalize? Do we legalize? A little bit of both. Yeah, and understanding how race and class, understanding how this country, the foundations of it, and how it's shaped by racism and what it was built on is really important to understanding drug policy and how it was shaped and what it's built on. And when you think about criminal justice reform, criminal justice system is actually a vast array of many different systems. So you think about community corrections, probation and parole, the prison system, state and federal. You have the court system. I mean, you name it, bail system, public defenders. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And so criminal justice reform, you can't take it on as a whole. You have to take it on as bits and pieces, right? And then the treatment industrial complex. So what we've started to see, and this is all public information, is that CCA and GEO Group, who are the two publicly traded on the stock market as well, corporations that run private prisons. And so they've started moving away from inmates. Right now they're housing illegal immigrants, or at the border. That's a big, specifically kids, that's a big thing they're doing right now. But another thing they're doing is they've started investing really heavily into medical and different treatment options. And you can see them turning the corner, how they're trying to shape the future of what they look like. They're not going away. And what we need to be careful about with this whole compassionate thought process about with drug users is that, this could turn into another prison industrial complex just looking different, right? Window dressing. And so, understanding that, are we providing individuals with comprehensive wraparound services, or is it just like checking boxes? Again, we're addicted to incarceration in this state. And until we address the social determinants, gentrification, I mean, the list goes on. And the needs-based looks like this, right? Focusing on the needs and the use. So I don't see anywhere in Maslow's hierarchy anything about stopping using drugs, right? So when we think about the three essentials of like food, shelter, clothing, right? Sleep, breathing. If I can't meet the physiological basic needs, I can't, then I'm going to continue self-medicating or self-harming and doing things that society deems is not okay. But maybe I don't think it's okay either. Maybe I don't want to be homeless and be using drugs either, but I can't maintain or get a foothold, even just eating every day. And so what we know, and the research shows, is that when you come from a needs-based and you establish these in order, that the things start coming, and people start gravitating away or towards, when you start providing individuals with wraparound services and treatment and therapy and all kinds of good stuff and jobs and housing, right? We see the shift away, or people wanting to do something different and move away from what they were doing.
If you ask the question, why are some drugs legal and others illegal? Why are cigarettes and alcohol legal and pharmaceuticals in the middle?
Sorry. Well then, it's all over. Now, so real quick, I wanted to, if anybody was late or not paying attention, then this is just a wrap up of kind of what I just talked about.
If you ask the question, why are some drugs legal and others illegal? Why are cigarettes and alcohol legal and pharmaceuticals in the middle and these other drugs, marijuana, other ones illegal? Some people sort of inherently assume, well, this must be because there was a thoughtful consideration of the relative risks of drugs. And, but then you think, well, that can't be, because we know alcohol is more associated with violence than almost any illegal drugs. And cigarettes are more addictive than any of the illegal drugs. I mean, heroin addicts routinely say it's harder to quit cigarettes than it is to quit heroin. So it's not as if there was ever any kind of National Academy of Science that 100 years ago decided that these drugs, these ones had to be illegal and those ones legal. And it's not as if this is in the Bible or in the Code of Hammurabi. I mean, nobody was making legal distinctions among many of these drugs until the 20th century, essentially. So if you ask how and why this distinction got made, what you realize when you look at the history is it has almost nothing to do with the relative risks of these drugs, and almost everything to do with who used and who was perceived to use these drugs, right? So there was, back in the 1870s, when the majority of opiate consumers were middle-aged white women, throughout the country, using them for their aches and pains and for their, when the time of the month and menopause, and there was no aspirin, there was no penicillin, lots of diarrhea because of bad sanitation, and nothing stops you up like opiates. I mean, millions, many more, a much higher percentage of the population back then used opiates than now, but nobody thought about criminalizing it because nobody wanted to put, auntie or grandma behind bars, right? But then when the Chinese start coming to the country in large numbers in the 1870s and 80s and, working on the railroads and working in the mines and working in factories and, and then going back home at the end of the night to smoke up a little opium the way they did in the old country, the same way white people were having a couple of whiskeys in the evening. And that's when you got the first opium prohibition laws in Nevada, in California, in the 1870s and 80s, directed at the Chinese minorities. It was all about the fear, what would those Chinamen with their opium do to our precious women, addicting them and seducing them and turning them into sex slaves and all this sort of stuff. The first anti-cocaine laws were in the South in the early part of the 20th century, directed at black men working on the docks, and the fear, what would happen to those black men when they took that white powder up their black noses and forgot their proper place in society, going out. First time anybody ever said that, cops needed a 38 would not bring down a Negro crazed on cocaine. You needed a 45. I mean, the New York Times, the paper of record reporting this stuff as fact back in those days. That's when you got the first cocaine prohibition laws. The first marijuana prohibition laws were in the Midwest and the Southwest, directed at Mexican migrants, Mexican Americans, taking the good jobs from the good white people, going back home to their communities, smoking a little of that funny smoking, marijuana, reefer, cigarette. And once again, the fear, what would this minority do to our precious women and children? So, it's always been about that. Even alcohol prohibition was to some extent a broader conflict between the white Americans and the not so white Americans, right? The white Americans coming from Northern and Western Europe in the 18th, early 19th century with all of their stuff. And then the not so white Americans coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, bringing with them their beer and their vino and their Schlivowitz, right? It was all about that type of conflict. And it wasn't as if the white Americans weren't also consuming. It's just many of them knew that when you criminalize a vice that is engaged in by a huge minority of the population, and you leave it inevitably to the discretion of law enforcement as to how to enforce those laws are not typically going to be enforced against the whiter and wealthier and more affluent or middle-class members of society. Inevitably, those laws will be disproportionately enforced against the poorer and younger and darker-skinned members of society. So to some very good extent, that's really what the war on drugs has been about. When people talk about it as the new Jim Crow, in this wonderful book by Michelle Alexander with that title, it's about understanding that, the war on drugs is not just about race, and it's not just about targeting black and brown young people, because God knows, millions of white people have been swept up in the war on drugs as well. But it is disproportionately and overwhelmingly about that, from its origins to its enforcement to who gets victimized today.
Yeah, so even, alcohol prohibition and everything it revolves around race and class, right? When it comes to drug policy and really thinking about, why is alcohol back legal, right? And so we got to remain vigilant in treatment and care of people who use drugs and understanding their history and experience in order to provide culturally competent systems of care that don't continue to inflict and create harms. All right.
Well, that was amazing. I know normally we have time for questions, but unfortunately
that was hard to get in an hour.
Yeah, I was definitely gonna say that was I am currently just like, wow. Just the first 5 minutes I was shook. So yeah, I'm sure that a lot of us have a lot of comments and probably a lot of questions. But we'll probably have to have a part 2 for this because, like I said, oh my gosh, that was a lot of information. Wow. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you so much, Jesse, for giving us that educational background. I took way too many notes. I had to organize them by slideshow yeah, so it's, I hope you all had good notes too. Before we leave, we did want to give Jay Dante a chance to talk about a project that's coming up that we're going to, that he's doing. And I'll just go ahead and hand it over to him real quick.
Good morning, everyone. And I'll be very quick because I know it's after that time. But on April 8th, I will be doing a discussion on Clubhouse. If you on Clubhouse, please feel free to contact me or join us. And if you're not on Clubhouse, I can help you get on Clubhouse. So just feel free to give me a contact. I'm gonna drop my email in the chat, but like I said, again, April 8th, we'll be on Clubhouse. Like I said, some people may be familiar, some people may not, but I think it'll be a great tool to continue this advocacy that we're doing. And the discussion for this one will be around PrEP in community pharmacies. So join us on April 8th.
April 8th, y'all. Okay, well, thank you all so much again for joining us. Thank you so much again, Jesse. That was amazing. We're probably going to need we're probably going to need a part 2.
Cool.
Yeah, so be on the lookout for that part 2, y'all. And I hope you enjoyed this day and go enjoy that weather. Enjoy this beautiful sunny day while it lasts before the rain comes around the corner.
All right, y'all be good. Be safe.